What's up, everybody? Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. I'm Clint Davis, your host. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. Today we will gather together and start a new book of the Bible. Last podcast we ended Ezra chapter 10, so we'll just jump right into the book of Nehemiah. That follows the book of Ezra in the English version of the Old Testament. Historically, Ezra and Nehemiah were considered to be one cohesive narrative in the original language, and so in the English Bible we've split them, but Ezra and Nehemiah follows closely after Ezra. In Ezra we read the story of the rebuilding of the temple after the exiles returned. The exiles returned from Babylon, the first wave, around 539 BC. The temple was completed about 516. So about 20 years after their return, 23 years after their initial return, they finished the temple. About 30 years later, Nehemiah comes onto the scene, and he returns to Jerusalem, and they begin to rebuild the wall. So it's a process over the years that takes almost 100 years to reestablish the presence of God's people in the city of Jerusalem. And I think that's an important point as we get started in the book of Nehemiah today, to remember that God works in his time, but oftentimes the timing that God uses doesn't necessarily line up with ours. We would want to think, especially living in a modern world with modern technology and conveniences, that it wouldn't take nearly that long to reestablish the communal life and the city life of the people of God after they return from captivity. But it's roughly 100 years from their initial return in 539 to the Nehemiah's return about 433. So technically it's 94 years. Nehemiah's return to Susa after the wall has been rebuilt in the city of Jerusalem. Took them 20-some years to build the temple, another 30 years to rebuild the wall. And so it's a lot going on, a lot happening, things not moving as quickly perhaps as we would like, but recognize that God is working and God is accomplishing his will. And at this point, we're still at the point of Nehemiah's return at the end of the book of Nehemiah, we're still 430 years from the coming of Christ. So it's a process that gives us historical perspective. I think it's important because we want everything done right now. In fact, I want it done yesterday. And we have to recognize sometimes we have to wait on God to accomplish his will. And just because he delays or tarries doesn't mean that it won't be done in appropriate manner at the appropriate time, for with God 1 day is 1,000 years. So the story of Nehemiah begins in verse 1, obviously of chapter 1, and Nehemiah receives a report from what is taking place in Jerusalem. This is what we read. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hananiah, one of thy brothers, came with a certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the exiles, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, I think this is fascinating because Nehemiah gives us some indicators as to the difficulties and the challenges the exiles faced when they returned home. Now, if you were with us when we read through the book of Ezra, you may have gotten tired of our consistent discussion of the building of the foundation and of the laying of the foundation, the building of the temple, and the people who were coming to oppose it. And if you read through it, you kind of get this idea that everything was smooth and went well. God provided, and certainly when we preach it and think about it and read it as it's recorded for us, we can fall into a trap perhaps of believing that everything just went very smoothly and that God just provided. But it's interesting here with Nehemiah because Nehemiah says he got a report from one of his brothers who had come from Judah with a man from Judah. And Nehemiah asked his brother and the man who with him about the state of the Jews, quote, who escaped, quote, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. So he wanted to know about how things were going in Jerusalem, but he wanted to know about how the Jews who had escaped and who had returned escaped. Now, King Cyrus said they could go back, but they had to escape, and they had to get to Jerusalem. They had to rebuild the walls, rebuild the temples. They had to retake their lands. They had a lot of opposition, and as they got back to their city, they had survived the exile. Who escaped and survived the exiles. Those are two verbs in the past tense, obviously, but those are two verbs that do not convey that it was easy. In fact, they convey a very difficult process: survived and escaped. You use the word escape when you talk about a dire situation. Someone escapes from prison or escapes from a difficult circumstance. You think about reading history and generals who had armies in war, different places. They escaped by the hair of their chin. They got out in the nick of time. There's an escape. This idea of getting out of a difficult circumstance. The exile was difficult and challenging. But also who survived the return, who survived the building of the temple, who survived the constant threat of enemies, who had been able to survive illnesses, etc. Life was hard for the people back then. Life's easy for us, very easy for us. In fact, we talk about suffering and how hard it is when things don't go our way, when we don't get invited to certain parties, or we don't get opportunities that we think we deserve, or we get overlooked, or someone says something negative to us, or we get a diagnosis that can be treated, but yet it makes us nervous and it's going to put us out of commission for a while. We talk about suffering in that context. I mean, these people really suffered. We have a very easy life. But they returned, and it's interesting that Nehemiah gives us this insight. This was a hard time to live in. This was a hard journey to make. This was a difficult time, and these people had escaped the exile, or escaped the exile and survived, and now they're still in danger because the report is the wall is broken down, the gates are destroyed by fire, and they're in grave danger. And so something must be done because life is still very much in doubt, in question. They are still living on the edge, so to speak. And something needed to be done to protect them from the enemies, protect them from the peoples who would seek their destruction, protect them from the invading armies and the invading peoples around them, so that they could thrive. This is survival, and God wants to move them to thriving. We most of the time thrive and yet think it's not, that we're just surviving. But God wants his people to flourish. And in order for his people to flourish, they have to be pure. They have to set themselves aside to him. They have to establish his worship. And they got to have a wall built so they can be protected from the outside, from the enemies on the outside. Interesting thoughts. You guys take care. God bless you. We'll catch you next time.